Right, so Rachel Reeves has just been handed the economic equivalent of a participation trophy, a 0.1% uptick in last year's growth forecast, and she's out here acting like she's just won the lottery, cured cancer and solved world hunger all before breakfast. Meanwhile, the International Monetary Fund has basically told Britain that our economic prospects for this year are about as exciting as watching paint dry in a magnolia living room, and we're now officially in the same economic boat as Italy. Not France, not Germany, Italy, the country whose governments change more frequently than most people change their bedsheets. But sure, Rachel, let's pop the champagne because 2025's forecast went from 1.3 to 1.4%. Absolutely thrilling stuff. Quick favor, if you're enjoying this economic carnage as much as we are, smash that subscribe button and hit the notifications bell. Over 94% of you haven't yet. It's free, takes 2 seconds, and keeps us bringing you the truth behind the Westminster spin. Cheers if you did. Right, back to the delusion. So, let us break down what has actually happened here, because the spin is so thick you could spread it on toast. The IMF, which is essentially the international organization that tells countries whether their economic homework is up to scratch, has released its latest forecasts for global growth, and Britain's outlook is, how do we put this delicately, absolutely pants. They've kept the UK's 2026 growth forecast at 1.3%, not upgraded it, not revised it upwards, just left it exactly where it was, gathering dust like that exercise bike everyone bought during lockdown and never used. Now, Britain and Italy are the only G7 nations that didn't get an upgrade for 2026. The G7, for those who don't follow international economics, is basically the club of the world's largest advanced economies. It is the Premier League of global economic power. And out of 7 countries, only 2 didn't get better forecasts, and we are one of them. The other is Italy, a country whose economic growth has been slower than a tortoise with arthritis for the past 2 decades. That is not company you want to keep. That is like being at school and finding out the only person who did worse than you on the test was the kid who spent the entire exam eating crayons. But Rachel Reeves, ever the optimist, or possibly just ever the politician, desperately clinging to any good news like a drowning person clutches driftwood, decided to focus on something else entirely. She highlighted that the IMF revised 2025's growth, last year's growth, from 1.3 to 1.4%. That is a 0.1% increase, 1/10 of 1%. To put that in perspective, if the UK economy were a car journey from London to Edinburgh, that 0.1% revision would get you approximately an extra half-mile down the road. Groundbreaking stuff. Reeves declared, and you can almost hear the desperation in her voice even through written words, after years of decline, this is the year the country turns a corner. Right, a corner, not a U-turn towards prosperity, not a motorway towards growth. A corner, which technically could just mean we're still going in roughly the same disappointing direction, just at a slightly different angle. She also maintained that Britain remained on course to be the fastest-growing European economy this year, which sounds impressive until you remember that European economic growth is currently about as dynamic as a sloth on sedatives. And this is where the Conservative opposition absolutely pounced, because they could smell blood in the water like sharks at a swimming gala. Shadow Chancellor Sir Mel Stride, who admittedly spent years in government presiding over economic mediocrity himself, but has now discovered the joys of opposition, dismissed Reeves' celebration as evidence of desperation rather than success. He said, and this is quite the quote, "A 0.1% uptick is not a triumph, and the fact Rachel Reeves is celebrating it shows how desperate she has become." He went on, "The economy is flatlining. After £66 billion of tax rises, business confidence has collapsed to record lows, inflation and unemployment are up, and growth is flat. Then he delivered the knockout line, gaslighting the country will not fix the economy. Only a serious plan to lower taxes and control welfare will. Now, putting aside the fact that the Conservatives had 14 years to implement such a plan and manifestly failed to do so, he has got a point about the gaslighting, because telling people the economy is turning a corner when all the evidence suggests it is actually reversing into a ditch is the political equivalent of standing in the rain and insisting it is just heavy mist. Conservative business spokesman Andrew Griffith piled on as well, saying Rachel Reeves is delusional if she thinks there's anything to celebrate. He pointed out that IMF projections show UK growth in 2026 and 2027 will be slower than the United States, slower than Canada, and even slower than most developing countries. That last bit really stings, does it not? Britain, former workshop of the world, centre of the largest empire in history, birthplace of the Industrial Revolution, is now growing slower than most developing countries. We are not just being lapped by economic powerhouses like America and China. We are being overtaken by countries we probably can't even locate on a map without Google's help. Griffith then added, Brits are getting poorer as a result. In fact, the only countries we beat are the snail-like EU countries, which makes it all the odder that Labour want to tie us more closely to them, which is a lovely bit of political point-scoring, because he gets to both criticise Labour's economic performance and take a shot at closer EU ties in one sentence. Efficient work, that. But here's where it gets really interesting, because the criticism is not just coming from Conservative politicians with obvious partisan motivations. It is also coming from the Resolution Foundation, a think tank that has traditionally been quite friendly to Labour. This is not the opposition making things up. This is an organisation with close ties to current Treasury ministers, telling them, politely but firmly, that they are making an absolute pig's ear of economic policy. So laden with contradictions and so perfectly emblematic of modern British politics that you absolutely need to understand what is actually happening beneath all the noise and fury. Quick favour, if you are loving this kind of political theatre, hit that subscribe button. Over 94% of viewers have not yet, and it is completely free. Takes a second and means the world to us. Thanks so much. If you did subscribe already, brilliant. Now let us crack on with what might be the most fascinating welfare row in recent memory. So, let us set the scene. Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, has decided that scrapping the two-child benefit cap is going to be Labour's big welfare move. Now, for those who might not be entirely familiar with what this cap actually does, let me break it down. The two-child limit means that families receive child benefit for their first two children, but if they have a third child, that third child does not get the benefit. It is, quite literally, a policy that says the government will help you with two kids, but after that, you're on your own. It was introduced by the Conservatives, and it has been an absolutely controversial policy from day one. Labour is now removing it, which means money will flow to around 450,000 children, potentially lifting them out of poverty by 2030. That's the big promise. That's the headline. And naturally, because this is British politics, everyone has immediately started arguing about exactly what this means, who it helps, and whether it is a good idea or an absolute disaster masquerading as compassion. Now, here is where Nigel Farage entered the chat, and this is where things got properly spicy. Farage came out and warned that Labour's policy means money for huge numbers of foreign-born people. That's the quote that has set absolutely everything on fire. He's essentially saying that because the policy does not discriminate based on where a person was born, it will benefit people who were not born in Britain, and that, he seems to suggest, is somehow problematic. This is where Rachel Reeves completely lost her patience, and honestly, you can almost understand why. Reeves essentially responded by painting a picture that is absolutely brutal in its clarity.
She asked, "Does Nigel Farage want to go around and say, 'White, yeah, you can have the money. Black, no, sorry, it's not for you'?" She then gave this incredibly specific example of a hypothetical mum who works in the National Health Service, who's lived here all her life, whose kids have lived here all their life, but who was born somewhere else. Under Farage's logic, that family would be denied the benefit, whilst a family next door who is British-born would get it. And Reeves said, quite bluntly, that makes her angry. That's not the sort of country she believes in. Fair point, really. The analogy cuts through all the noise and gets to the absolute heart of what Farage seems to be suggesting. She then went even further and suggested to The Guardian that Farage's comments were, by her assessment, racist. Not dog whistle racism, not problematic, not insensitive, racist. She said, "I don't really care what color a kid's skin is. Some deserve to be in poverty and some do not. That makes me pretty angry." Now that's a statement that puts down a marker. That's Reeves saying she's willing to use that word, willing to make that accusation, and frankly, willing to own it. Now, naturally, Reform absolutely hit back, and this is where it gets genuinely interesting, because the counter-argument is where we start to see the cracks in the logical foundation of what Reeves is saying. Zaya Youssef, Reform's policy chief, came out swinging and accused Reeves of ethno-nationalism.